pretty soon. And we are live. Okay, Elena, we are starting metaphysics. We did the intro class. Now we're going to do the intro to ontology class, and we'll probably read the first and sort of the most important essay in this section. Again, I'm picking anthologies that lean in a direction different from my inclinations philosophically. We remember the core curriculum is, here, let me click over here, is these 2 years plus the third year. But there's an alternative third year curriculum by Tartaglia, which is coming, which focuses on Quine. And the main essay we're going to read in this section is on Quine, is by Quine. And so the section's ontology. We're going to be reading Quine, and then we're going to read a lot of essays responding to Quine and giving alternatives and that sort of thing. So let's do the intro to this section. If I should actually have pulled this up just to give us some context here. Let's look for this one. We'll pull this one up real quickly just to remind ourselves. This was the slides from last time. We're going to be doing ontology, identity, modality, properties, causation, persistence, persons, and then objects. Okay, so this is the ontology section, and we do a lot of metaphysics of God and other things in the other classes. So again, I'm picking anthologies here that'll lean in a focus and a focus on thinkers that are sort of different from the way I like to think so that we get a good balance. Okay, so these are the essays we're going to be looking at. Okay, so ontology is simply asking the question, what is there? And a specific individual's ontology is just a list of all the things they think exist. You might think baseballs, mountains, and molecules exist. You might think earthquakes, parties, and home runs exist. That's different, right? Well, you could have a red house and a red flower. Maybe redness exists, properties. What about numbers? What about fictional characters? These are the kinds of questions we're going to ask in ontological metaphysics. We're going to also ask of the two main tendencies. Like there always seems to be a conversation in every subject, and it's between two opposing inclinations, right? So you can think of paleontologists who find a new fossil of a community, a colony of trilobites. And they say, I've discovered a new species, because they always want to split up new species. And other ones say, no, these are all related to each other, and they could have reproduced with the other species we already know exist. And so you kind of have a tendency to split or to group. And we just see this everywhere. Well, one of the sort of meta questions we're going to ask in ontology is, should we be inclined to have concern for overpopulation in our ontology, right? Should we extract needlessly superfluous concepts? Should we try to like reduce and cross off the list of our ontology a bunch of things that aren't needed if we can get away with fewer terms? Or should we be unconcerned with that project and go for a plethora of items? Okay, so these are the essays we're going to read on what there is by Quine. And again, a lot of the rest of the essays are sort of responding to him or giving alternatives to his perspective. We're going to read Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology. We're going to read an article or a dialogue called Holes that was written by David and Stephanie Lewis, which is really fun to read, actually. It's a great conversation. So let's get into this. The one we're going to read today is Quine on What There Is. No properties, no fictional characters, no meanings allowed. We can escape them by translating our talk of such things into talk of only respectable entities, he says. The paraphrases that we do when we do our translation, when we seem to be talking about things like that, those are actually the true intentions behind our sloppier speech. So Quine wants to make everything nice and clean and neat and say, look, don't be silly. You can't tell me how much yellowness weighs. You can't throw me a number. So let's get all of that stuff out of there. Or maybe, I'm not sure what his position is on numbers exactly, actually. We're going to find out. But I do know that what we're also going to read is that he has a method for determining, okay, these are the nice, clean things I want to keep, and those other things we can get rid of. And if we're talking about other things, we just need to translate that talk into maybe more convoluted talk. Perhaps that talk is useful in some way, but its true meaning can be revealed in the way that we paraphrase and translate it into talk of the things that we actually find respectable. And for him, this is the method, we should only be including in our ontologies the entities that are required by our best scientific theories. So fields might exist. Okay, so it's not like he's being a materialist exactly. He's saying the things that which we should affirm exist are the things which we can't escape talking about in our best scientific theories. After that, we'll read Rudolf Carnap, who has a slightly different view in his empiricism, semantics, and ontology view, but it's very similar to Quine. But he says, look, why don't we not worry about that so much? Why don't we notice that there are frameworks? Within the framework of mathematics, it's appropriate to talk about numbers. But it's weird to ask, do numbers really exist? Because we understand when we're in the framework of mathematics that we're in that framework. And so it's okay to talk about it there, and we don't have to do a bunch of translation and stuff. Just recognize that that's not really ontological exactly. It's we've decided to play a specific game where those are the words that we use, kind of a thing. So we'll do him justice by reading the Argyle and Bargle conversation between those two fictional characters. It's going to be a lot of fun by David and Stephanie Lewis. Beyond Being and Nothing, we take this old view that a complete ontology has to include objects that do not exist. Munungian view. If a sentence is meaningful, the terms must be referring to something. So if I say Pegasus flies, Pegasus is referring to something. Now, we know that it's fictional, so we're not saying it really exists maybe in a material way, but it's at least possible for it to exist. Welcome, Roger. We're just doing the intro to the ontology section, and then we're going to read the Quine paper, which is the main one of this section, and everybody else is responding to him in some way. Stephen Yablo will then read, does ontology rest on a mistake? Gives a challenge to Quine. Even a great deal of our scientific talk, he says, is figurative. I don't think you can get out of this, Quine. Metaphor and make-believe play a valuable, perhaps an indispensable role in the communication and reasoning that we're doing in our best scientific theories. Even our best theories might require the figurative. Unless we can distinguish clearly between the literal and the figurative talk inside scientific theories, and he gives reasons why we probably can't, this isn't going to get off the ground, buddy. This ain't going to work. It doesn't solve the problem. Then we look at Amy L. Thomason, who's probably going to give a better argument for the thing that I just happened to look at the last time we were here, which is maybe fictional objects are real, maybe fictional characters are real, and she talks about what it takes to make them real and for them to stay around, and that's going to be a really fun essay. She defines them. Schaefer on what grounds what. So the last essay we're going to read is going to sort of be another one of these, let's debate fundamentalism and foundationalism, I mean, and let's bring that into the conversation. And he endorses a monist view that fundamentally there really is only one thing, the cosmos. So there's parts of it, perhaps aspects, attributes, other things, properties, entities within, parts, but parts of a whole. Okay, so that's what we're going to get into. Let's do it. Let's do it. Read on What There Is by Quine. Anybody have anything to say on the intro? Welcome back, Roger. Good to see you again.
It's good to be back. Nice to hear you in your lessons.
Let's get ready to rock, baby. All right. Quine is nice and clean and pure and beautiful. And like we said before, all this Nietzsche third year stuff that I do, there's an alternative third year curriculum being put together right now by Dr. Tartaglia, which focuses on Quine as the backbone and saying, look, he's taking this other voice forward, and let's look at the others who go along with him and continue the conversation in that more Aristotelian way, perhaps. So Quine's a big deal, and we're reading him in this year one course in Metaphysics on Ontology, and his essay is going to be the one everybody's responding to more or less in one way or another. Okay, here we go. Should we do a friendly simultaneous sip first?
I feel like we should. Let me get my
you take your time. First. Go get your water. I feel like we're back together, friends. If anybody's watching on X, you can go and find the link to join us on video here. Eventually, these things will be private, but for now, there's still some room to join in, and we'll get rocking on Quine. If YouTube wasn't such a pain in the butt, we'd play music and stuff in the meantime. All right.
Sorry for the hold up. Here it is.
It's good to see y'all again. What we're going to do now is search for our cups, our mugs, our glasses, our tankards, our chalice, our thermos, our stein, our canteen jug or flask, our vessel of any kind filled with our favorite liquids. RC Cola will work. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes literally all the things better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Some good stuff there, my friends. Quine it is. A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover, in a word. Everything. And everyone will accept this answer as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is. There remains room for disagreement over cases, and so the issue has stayed alive down the centuries. Suppose now, he says, that 2 philosophers, MCX and I, differ over ontology. Suppose McX maintains that there is something which I maintain there is not. He maintains there is something which I maintain there is not. McX can, quite consistently with his own point of view, describe our differences of opinion by saying that I refuse to recognize certain entities. I should protest, of course, that he is wrong in his formulation of our disagreement, for I maintain that there are no entities of the kind which he alleges for me to recognize. But my finding him wrong in his formulation of our disagreement is unimportant, for I am committed to considering him wrong in his ontology anyway. When I try to formulate our difference of opinion, on the other hand, I seem to be in a predicament. I cannot admit that there are some things which McX countenances, and I do not. For in admitting that there are such things, I should be contradicting my own rejection of them. It would appear, if this reasoning were sound, that in any ontological dispute, the proponent of the negative side suffers the disadvantage of not being able to admit that his opponent disagrees with him. Right? It's interesting. We'll paraphrase it in a moment. This is the old Platonic riddle of non-being. Non-being must, in some sense, be. Otherwise, what is it that there is not? This tangled doctrine might be nicknamed Plato's beard. Historically, it has proved tough, frequently dulling the edge of Occam's razor. It is some such line of thought that leads philosophers like McX to impute being where they might otherwise be quite content to recognize that there is nothing. Thus, take Pegasus. If Pegasus were not, McX argues, we should not be talking about anything when we use the word. Therefore, it would be nonsense to say even that Pegasus is not. Thinking to show thus that the denial of Pegasus cannot be coherently maintained, he concludes that Pegasus is. McX cannot, indeed, quite persuade himself that any region of space-time, near or remote, contains a flying horse of flesh and blood. Pressed for further details on Pegasus, then, he says that Pegasus is an idea in men's minds. Here, however, a confusion begins to be apparent. We may, for the sake of argument, concede that there is an entity, and even a unique entity, though this is rather implausible, which is the mental Pegasus idea. But this mental entity is not what people are talking about when they deny Pegasus, right? If somebody says, I don't believe that Pegasus is a real flying horse somewhere, they don't mean, I don't believe that men have in their minds this notion of a flying horse. They mean there is no flesh and blood flying horse. McX never concedes the Parthenon with the Parthenon idea. The Parthenon is physical. The Parthenon idea is mental, according to McX's version of ideas, and I have no better to offer. The Parthenon is visible. The Parthenon idea is invisible. We cannot easily imagine 2 things more unlike and less liable to confusion than the Parthenon and the Parthenon idea. But when we shift from the Parthenon to Pegasus, the confusion sets in, for no other reason than that McX would sooner be deceived by the crudest and most flagrant counterfeit than grant the non-being of Pegasus. Right? All because why? All because, well, I must mean something when I'm talking about it, right? I got to be referring to something. The notion that Pegasus must be, because it would otherwise be nonsense to say even that Pegasus is not, has been seen to lead McX into an elementary confusion. Subtler minds, taking the same precept as their starting point, come out with theories of Pegasus which are less patently misguided than McX's and correspondingly more difficult to eradicate. One of these subtler minds is named, let's say, Wyman. Pegasus, Wyman maintains, has his being as an unactualized possible. Okay, an unactualized possible. When we say of Pegasus that there is no such thing, we are saying more precisely that Pegasus does not have the special attribute of actuality. Saying that Pegasus is not actual is on a par logically with saying that the Parthenon is not red. In either case, we are saying something about an entity whose being is unquestioned. So you can still have your cake then, right? It still exists. It still is a thing, but it's a thing. We're referring to a thing that isn't real or isn't actual, but we know what we're referring to. Otherwise, we couldn't debate it or talk about it, even its existence. We say that Pegasus that is no such thing. We are saying more precisely that Pegasus does not have the special attribute of actuality. That's like saying the Parthenon is not red. It's a property of the thing. In either case, we're saying something about an entity whose being is still unquestioned. So that view still says there is a Pegasus. It's just not actualized. Wyman, by the way, is one of those philosophers who have united in ruining the good old word exist. Despite his espousal of unactualized possibilities, he limits the word existence to actuality, thus preserving an illusion of ontological agreement between himself and us who repudiate the rest of his bloated universe. We have all been prone to say in our common sense usage of exist that Pegasus does not exist, meaning simply that there is no such entity at all. If Pegasus existed, he would indeed be in space and time, but only because the word Pegasus has spatio-temporal connotations, right? It's not true of numbers, right? You could say numbers exist without them being in space and time, but if you say Pegasus exists, that means there's a flesh and blood flying horse somewhere, because that's the idea of what the connotation of being a Pegasus. And not because exists has spatio-temporal connotations. If spatio-temporal reference is lacking when we affirm the existence of the cube root of 27, this is simply because a cube root is not spatio-temporal kind of thing, and not because we are being ambiguous in our use of the word exist. However, Wyman, in an ill-conceived effort to appear agreeable, genially grants us the non-existence of Pegasus, and then, contrary to what we mean by non-existence of Pegasus, insists that Pegasus is. Existence is one thing, he says. Substance is another. The only way I know of coping with this obfuscation of issues is to give Wyman the word exist. I'll try not to use it again. I still have is. So much for lexicography. Let's get back to Wyman's ontology. Wyman's overpopulated universe is in many ways unlovely. All right, we're seeing a trend, an inclination, a tendency, a taste. It offends the aesthetic sense of us who have a taste for desert landscapes. But this is not the worst of it. Wyman's slum of possibles is a breeding ground for disorderly elements. Take, for instance, the possible fat man in that doorway, and again, the possible bald man in that doorway. Are they the same possible man or two possible men? How do we decide? How many possible men are there in that doorway? Are there more possible thin ones than fat ones? How many of them are alike? Or would their being alike make them one? Are no two possible things alike? Is this the same as saying that it is impossible for two things to be alike? Or finally, is the concept of identity simply inapplicable to unactualized possibilities? But that sense can be found in taking the entities which cannot meaningfully be said to be identical with themselves and distinct from one another. These elements are well nigh incorrigible. By a Phrygian therapy of individual concepts, some effort might be made at rehabilitation, but I feel we'd do better simply to clear Wyman's slum and be done with it. You can see why Tartaglia loves the way he writes and thinks. Possibility, along with the other modalities of necessity and impossibility and contingency, raises problems upon which I do not mean to imply that we should turn our backs. But we can at least limit modalities to whole statements. We may impose the adverb possibly upon a statement as a whole. And we may well worry about the semantical analysis of such usage, but little real advance in such analysis is to be hoped for in expanding our universe to include so-called possible entities. I suspect that the main motive for this expansion is simply the old notion that Pegasus, for example, must be, because otherwise it would be nonsense to say even that he is not. Right? This is back to the same thing. Well, what are you talking about? You tell me there's no such thing as Pegasus. No such thing as what? Well, Pegasus. What? You know that thing. What? Oh, it exists. It must exist if the word is referring to something.
If I may.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is particular to things that exist in the child way of saying exists, Pegasus existing as a flesh and blood horse, etc., is Pegasus influences the physical universe in a very common way, in which beings with corporeality, with a physical presence, bump into atoms and whatever, just like our bodies do.
Pegasus
So
influences that.
yeah, if
How
Pegasus
more
as
real
a
could you want to be?
yeah, but if Pegasus as a flying horse existed, bear with me a bit,
Yeah.
just like other horses and unwinged, boring horses, yeah, they eat grass and whatnot. And if Pegasus actually existed, he would influence the world also by eating grass at least, and other thing, and pushing through atoms and molecules from the atmosphere by flying.
But he
But
doesn't do that, you're saying.
since he doesn't do that in any of these senses, he exists in another way of existing. I agree that Pegasus influences the chronology of the universe still, but in a very different causal nature than.
You think Pegasus does influence the other
Yeah,
things that
yeah.
exist? Well, how
As
much more could you want to be than that? You must
yeah,
exist if you're doing that.
as a concept that exists in the collective consciousness for one, and in individual minds for the other. And when you learn about Pegasus being mounted by Bellerophon, who slays the Chimera and whatnot, it's really fascinating to get into contact with the concept of a flying horse. It's awesome.
But Quine would say you're confusing Pegasus with the Pegasus idea. What do you say to him there? If the
Well,
Pegasus idea is real, perhaps it
yeah,
influences people.
I agree that the Pegasus idea is real, because you cannot unprove it simply because we are talking, we are describing the Pegasus idea. There's no going around it. It
So
exists.
maybe the Pegasus idea exists, but he doesn't want to say Pegasus exists.
Yeah, well, he has no evidence to support that Pegasus exists or existed.
But he doesn't think Pegasus exists.
It's rather reasonable if someone has any idea of the natural history of Earth. It's kind of, it makes kind of sense that there is no horse with such big wings like we see in birds, avian birds. It makes sense that this
Okay.
does not exist
Okay, so you agree with Klein.
physically.
It's really interesting what you say because your specific formulation of affecting the chronology
Yeah,
of the things we do say exist
that's
would
that's
make
what
Quine want to
that's what
say, well, it
I
must exist then. He
that's
doesn't want
what
to say
I
that.
mean by exist. If it influences the chronology causally, if it has, as the Hindus would say, karma, if it has some karmic relationship in the state of affairs in the chronology, yeah, then it exists. It exists in some sense, but it could exist conceptually, or it could exist actually in a manifest atomic molecular form.
All right. I mean, it's not about what I think. I mean, you already know I think fictional entities do exist, but Quine certainly doesn't. Quine doesn't want to say anything like that. So we're going to figure out what Quine thinks about it. But if you said to Quine, it affects the physical world, that almost hints that maybe it's inescapably a part of something that we'd have to take account of scientifically, in which case he would want to think it exists. So he must not agree with you on the idea that if he doesn't think the Pegasus idea exists, he can't think that. And if he doesn't think the Pegasus idea exists, which maybe he does think, then he also can't think that of the Pegasus idea. So let's see where he goes. I suspect that the main motive for this expansion is simply the old notion that Pegasus must exist in some way if it's referring to something. So we even say it doesn't exist, we're still referring to it. Still, all the rank luxuriance of Wyman's universe of possibles would seem to come to naught when we make a slight change in the example and speak not of Pegasus, but of the round square cupola on Berkeley College. If, unless Pegasus were, it would be nonsense to say that he is not, then by the same token, unless the round square cupola on Berkeley College were, it would be nonsense to say that it is not. But unlike Pegasus, the round square cupola on Berkeley College cannot be admitted even as an unactualized possible. Can we drive Wyman now to admitting also a realm of unactualizable impossibilities? If so, a good many embarrassing questions could be asked about them. We might hope even to trap Wyman in contradictions by getting him to admit that certain of these entities are at once round and square. But the wily Wyman chooses the other horn of the dilemma and concedes that it is nonsense to say that the round square cupola on Berkeley College is not. He says that the phrase round square cupola is meaningless. Wyman is not the first to embrace this alternative. All right, so again, we have the familiar thing that we're getting to see in a lot of essays. There's a difference between a unicorn and a square circle, right? Both of them don't exist in actuality, perhaps, but a unicorn is a possibility, and a square circle, a lot of philosophers want to say that's just sounds you're making with your mouth. That doesn't mean anything. Like that's you can't make me say something about that because that's not an idea in my head. It's meaningless. It's self-contradictory.
Well, just one thing.
Mm.
If we are thinking in terms of classical mechanics, of classical physics, yeah, and Euclidean space, you cannot conceptualize a round square or something like that. You can't have some shape that has properties that seem that they are Boolean, that seem that they exclude one another.
Mhm.
However, if you delve out of the realm of classical physics and Euclidean space into the quantum realm, you have stuff that exists in the same place, in different places at the same time, literally, and cats being alive and dead at the same time. And maybe you can also have stuff, maybe a technological artifact from a super advanced civilization. They really wanted to make this piece of art that behaved
The
both as
square
a
circle.
circle and like a square circle, but they needed to tap into the magic of the quantum realm, and so that thing is both the square and the circle at the same time because it
Mm.
uses quantum mechanics,
Okay,
quantum
so
physics.
maybe Roger can think about a square circle. There are philosophers who believe in an absurdity element to things. And so, yeah, but they're not the majority right now. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just Quine is agreeing with Wyman that, okay, we're not going to talk about that. But that's just because maybe Quine is limited to not being able to consider those things. We won't go into the science stuff right now. But okay, so you're saying that the absurd and self contradictory could be an element of being as well. It's worth considering. We'll let it float there for a while. Wyman was not the first to embrace this alternative. The doctrine of the meaninglessness of contradictions runs a way back. The tradition survives, moreover, in writers who seem to share none of Wyman's motivations. Still, I wonder whether the first temptation to such a doctrine may not have been substantially the motivation which we have observed in Wyman. Certainly, the doctrine has no intrinsic appeal, and it has led its devotees to such quixotic extremes as that of challenging the method of proof by reductio ad absurdum, a challenge in which I sense a reductio ad absurdum of the doctrine itself. Moreover, the doctrine of meaninglessness of contradictions has the severe methodological drawback that it makes it impossible in principle ever to devise an effective test of what is meaningful and what is not. Huh. Is he agreeing with you here? The doctrine of the meaninglessness of contradictions. He doesn't want to use that way out of it, I guess. It would be forever impossible for us to devise systemic ways of deciding whether a string of signs made sense, even to us individually, let alone other people or not. For it follows from a discovery in mathematical logic due to Church that there can be no generally applicable test of contradictoriness. Ugh, ouch. All right, so we know that in the logical positivist movement and with Quine, we really need Tartaglia to show up. He's got a whole third-year alternative course on all this stuff, and we're getting familiar with the way these guys think. I have spoken disparagingly of Plato's beard and hinted that it is tangled. I have dwelt at length on the inconveniences of putting up with it. It is time to think about taking steps. He wants to shave Plato. Russell, in his theory of so-called singular descriptions, showed clearly how we might meaningfully use seeming names without supposing that there be the entities allegedly named. Okay, so he wants to get us out of this. Say, I can say Pegasus does not exist, and that's not a contradiction. I know what Pegasus is referring to, but that doesn't mean it exists. When I say it doesn't exist, then I'm affirming its existence. The names to which Russell's theory, that's the way he wants out of it, not this other. The names to which Russell's theory directly applies are complex descriptive names such as the author of Waverley, the present King of France, the round square cupola on Berkeley College. Russell analyzes such phrases. Russell analyzes such phrases systematically as fragments of the whole sentences in which they occur. The sentence, the author of Waverley was a poet, for example, is explained as a whole. Now, this is what the logical positivists love to do. They love to take the sentence, which is giving them trouble, and translate it into what we really mean when we're saying it and see if they can get rid of the problem that way. So here's how he's going to do it. The author of Waverley was a poet means someone, better something, wrote Waverley and was a poet, and nothing else wrote Waverley. The point of this added clause is to affirm the uniqueness which is implied in the word the, in the author of Waverley. The sentence, the round square cupola on Berkeley College is pink, is explained as something is round and square and is a cupola on Berkeley College and is pink, and nothing else is round and square and a cupola on Berkeley College. The virtue of this analysis, that's what they do. They want to analyze the sentences and find the way they're being used amongst the peers who use them in order to figure out what they really mean. That's their whole game. The virtue of this analysis is that the seeming name, a descriptive phrase, is paraphrased in context as a so-called incomplete symbol. No unified expression is offered as an analysis of the descriptive phrase, but the statement as a whole, which was the context of that phrase, still gets its full quota of meaning, whether true or false. The unanalyzed statement, the author of Waverley was a poet, contains a part, the author of Waverley, which is wrongly supposed by McX and Wyman to demand objective reference in order to be meaningful at all. But in Russell's translation, something wrote Waverley and was a poet and nothing else wrote Waverley. The burden of objective reference, which has been put upon the descriptive phrase, is now taken over by words of the kind that logicians call bound variables, variables of quantification, namely words like something, nothing, everything. These words, far from purporting to be names specifically of the author of Waverley, do not purport to be names at all. They refer to entities generally, with a kind of studied ambiguity peculiar to themselves. These quantificational words or bound variables are, of course, a basic part of language, and their meaningfulness, at least in context, is not to be challenged. But their meaningfulness in no way presupposes there being either the author of Waverley or the round square cupola on Berkeley College or any other specifically preassigned objects. Okay, so he's translating it into something is this thing, and they say, well, something doesn't refer to a thing that has to be. It's just saying something, and then talking about what it's like. But that doesn't mean that it's including the actual or the real as a property of it, perhaps. Where descriptions are concerned, there is no longer any difficulty in affirming or denying being. There is the author of Waverley is explained by Russell as meaning someone, or more strictly something, wrote Waverley and nothing else wrote Waverley. The author of Waverley is explained correspondingly as the alternation, either each thing failed to write Waverley or two or more things wrote Waverley. This alternation is false but meaningful, and it contains no expression purporting to name the author of Waverley. You see how they're doing this? They're saying, at first I said the author of Waverley has red hair. I'm pointing to a person and saying he has red hair. He says, no. What you really mean when you use that sentence is something wrote Waverley, and that thing has red hair, and nothing else wrote Waverley. That's so if we now, it might be cumbersome to talk that way, but when I use something, I'm not pointing at something specific. I'm saying there is a thing that wrote Waverley, and here's some other things about it. Now he thinks he can say there is a thing called Pegasus and it doesn't exist, because I wasn't pointing to Pegasus and saying it doesn't exist. I was saying something we refer to as Pegasus, that thing is not actually real. I think that's where he's going. Okay, the author of Waverley is not. Okay, go ahead.
You just made me remember this girl that became very, very famous on the internet by saying on a plane, that man is not real. I think it was that. Yeah. So it's also kind of like an.
I've been in love since the day I saw that woman.
It's kind of like an ontological statement as well.
Yeah. That motherfucker's not real. Spooky. Okay. The statement, the round square cupola on Berkeley College is not, is analyzed in similar fashion. So the old notion that statements of non-being defeat themselves goes by the board. When a statement of being or non-being is analyzed by Russell's theory of descriptions, it ceases to contain any expression which even purports to name the alleged entity whose being is in question, so that the meaningfulness of the statement no longer can be thought to presuppose that there be such an entity. Now, what of Pegasus? This being a word rather than a descriptive phrase, Russell's argument does not immediately apply to it. However, it can easily be made to apply. We have only to rephrase Pegasus as a description in any way that seems adequately to single out our idea. Say, the winged horse that was captured by Bellerophon, substituting such a phrase for Pegasus. We can then proceed to analyze the statement Pegasus is, or Pegasus is not, precisely on the analogy of Russell's analysis of the author of Waverley is, or the author of Waverley is not. In order thus to subsume a one-word name or alleged name, such as Pegasus, under Russell's theory of description, we must, of course, be able first to translate the word into a description. But that's no real restriction. If the notion of Pegasus had been so obscure or so basic a one that no pat translation into a descriptive phrase had offered itself along familiar lines, we could still have availed ourselves of the following artificial and trivial seeming device. We could have appealed to the ex hypothesi, unanalyzable, irreducible attribute of being Pegasus, adopting for its expression the verb is Pegasus or Pegasizes. The noun Pegasus itself could then be translated as derivative and identified, after all, with a description, the thing that is Pegasus, the thing that Pegasizes. If the importing of such a predicate is Pegasizes seems to commit to us to recognizing that there is a corresponding attribute, Pegasizing, in Plato's heaven or in the minds of men, well and good. Neither we, nor Wyman, nor McX have been contending thus far about the being or non-being of universals, but rather about that of Pegasus. If, in terms of Pegasizing, we can interpret the noun Pegasus as a description subject to Russell's theory of descriptions, then we have disposed of the old notion that Pegasus cannot be said not to be without presupposing that in some sense Pegasus is. Our argument is now quite general. McX and Wyman suppose that we could not meaningfully affirm a statement of the form so and so is not with a simple or descriptive singular noun in place of so unless so and so is. This supposition is now seen to be quite generally groundless, since the singular noun in question can always be expanded into a singular description, trivially or otherwise, and then analyzed out a la Russell. We commit ourselves to an ontology containing numbers. All right, let's just pause. I wish he had given us the sentence, but we got the idea. The thing, I wonder if we could do it more sloppily just to make it clear. I don't know if I'm breaking Coin's rules here. I wish Tartaglia had shown up. The thing men call Pegasus does not exist. Am I still pointing at it, or is that just a descriptor? I don't know. I'm not sure if it works. We commit ourselves to an ontology containing numbers when we say there are prime numbers larger than 1,000,000. We commit ourselves to an ontology containing centaurs when we say there are centaurs. And we commit ourselves to an ontology containing Pegasus when we say Pegasus is. But we do not commit ourselves to an ontology containing Pegasus or the author of Waverley or the round square cupola in Berkeley College, or when we say that Pegasus or the author of Waverley or the cupola in question is not. We need no longer labor under the delusion that the meaningfulness of a statement containing a singular term presupposes an entity named by that term. A singular term need not name to be significant. So what's its significance? Found in the translation of a descriptive form. That's where you can see the significance of using the name other than actually pointing to something. An inkling of this might have dawned on Wyman and McX, even without benefit of Russell, if they had only noticed, as so few of us do, that there is a gulf between meaning and naming, even in the case of a singular term, which is genuinely the name of an object. The following example from Frigga will serve. The phrase evening star names a certain large physical object of spherical form which is hurtling through space some scores of millions of miles from here. The phrase morning star names the same thing, as was probably first established by some observant Babylonian. But the two phrases cannot be regarded as having the same meaning. Otherwise, that Babylonian could have dispensed with his observations and contented himself with reflecting on the meanings of his words. The meanings, then, being different from one another, must be other than the named object, which is one and the same in both cases. Confusion of meaning with naming not only made McX think he could not meaningfully repudiate Pegasus, a continuing confusion of meaning and naming no doubt helped engender his absurd notion that Pegasus is an idea, a mental entity. The structure of his confusion is as follows. He confused the alleged named object, Pegasus, with the meaning of the word Pegasus, therefore concluding that Pegasus must be in order that the word have meaning. But what sorts of things are meanings? This is a moot point. However, one might quite plausibly explain meanings as ideas in the mind, supposing we can make clear sense in turn of the idea of ideas of the mind. Therefore, supposing we can also make sense of ideas of the mind. Therefore, Pegasus, initially confused with a meaning, ends up as an idea in the mind. It is the more remarkable that Wyman, subject to the same initial motivation as McX, should have avoided this particular blunder and wound up with unactualized possibles instead. Now, let us turn to the ontological problem. of universals. The question whether there are such entities as attributes, relations, classes, numbers, functions. McX, characteristically enough, thinks there are. Speaking of attributes, he says, there are red houses, red roses, red sunsets. This much is pre philosophical common sense in which we must all agree. These houses, roses, and sunsets then have something in common. And this, which they have in common, is all I mean by the attribute of redness. So for McX, redness exists. For McX, thus, their being attributes is even more obvious and trivial than the obvious and trivial fact of there being red houses, roses, and sunsets. This, I think, is characteristic of metaphysics, or at least of that part of metaphysics called ontology. One who regards a statement on this subject as true at all must regard it as trivially true. One's ontology is basic to the conceptual scheme by which he interprets all experiences, even the most commonplace ones, judged within some particular conceptual scheme. And how else is judgment possible? An ontological statement goes without saying, standing in need of no separate justification at all. Ontological statements follow immediately from all manner of causal statements of commonplace fact, just as, from the point of view anyway of McX's conceptual scheme, there is an attribute follows from there are red houses, red roses, red sunsets. Judged in another conceptual scheme, an ontological statement which is axiomatic to McX's mind may, with equal immediacy and triviality, be adjudicated as false. One may admit that there are red houses, roses, and sunsets, but deny, except as a popular and misleading manner of speaking, that they have anything in common. The words houses, roses, and sunsets are true of sundry individual entities, which are houses and roses and sunsets, and the word red or red object is true of each of sundry individual entities, which are red houses, red roses, red sunsets, but there is not, in addition, any entity whatever, individual or otherwise, which is named by the word redness, nor, for that matter, by the word househood, rosehood, or sunsethood. That the houses and roses and sunsets are all of them red may be taken as ultimate and irreducible, and it may be held that McX is no better off in point of real explanatory power for all the occult entities which he posits under such names as redness. Once again, we see the logical positivist translating the everyday way that we're talking into what he thinks we really mean, like what it often boils down to, what we could be referring to that another person could also point to. There's a scientism in it.
Now I can use my scientism language to troll you with regarding the colors,
Sure.
because that can that you were just holding, well, it's actually not red. It reflects light that our optical processing systems in our brains interpret as the experience of red.
Mhm.
But the light is colorless fundamentally.
How
There's
about
no
this?
color. There's literally no color
Is it
intrinsically
solid?
in light. I have
Is it solid?
I have no idea.
The
I cannot
can.
see inside the can.
No,
I
I mean, is it is it a liquid? Is it a gas, this can, or is it a solid?
Oh, okay. So yeah, well, it's not flowing anywhere. So yeah, it's probably a solid. It's more
All right.
probably a solid.
So the can has a property of being impenetrable. It's solid. It takes up space. So is this pack of cigarettes. So is this empty bottle. They're solid. Is solidness a thing in the world? Is that in our ontology? Solidness?
It is part of the Platonic elements and also the same elements held by the Buddhists and Hindus. So it's a very long-standing way to categorize matter, basically.
Yeah, Quine wants to say no. There's no independent solidness. There are sundry objects which are solid, but that doesn't mean that solidness is out there as a thing.
Yeah, probably it's in the demiurge's mind. And if we understand the world, maybe it pops up in our mind as well.
I wanted to switch it to solid because I know what you're saying about color, but we're trying to just deal with like, okay, what are these guys arguing over? Properties. One means by which McX might naturally have tried to impose his ontology of universals on us was already removed before we turned to the problem of universals. McX cannot argue that predicates such as red or is red, which we all concur in using, must be regarded as names each of a single universal entity in order that they be meaningful at all. For we have seen that being a name of something is a much more special feature than being meaningful. He cannot even charge us, at least not by that argument, with having posited an attribute of pegasizing by our adoption of the predicate pegasizes. However, McX hits upon a different stratagem. Let us grant, he says, this distinction between meaning and naming of which you make so much. Let us even grant that is red or pegasizes, etc., are not names of attributes. Still, you admit they have meanings. But these meanings, whether they are named or not, are still universals. And I venture to say that some of them might even be the very things that I call attributes, or something to much the same purpose in the end. For McX, this is an unusually penetrating speech, and the only way I know there's some sarcasm in the logical positivists, which you either like or it gets old. It's okay, we like it. For McX, this is an unusually penetrating speech, and the only way I know to counter it is by refusing to admit meanings. However, I feel no reluctance towards refusing to admit meanings, for I do not thereby deny that words and statements are meaningful. McX and I may agree to the letter of our classification of linguistic forms into the meaningful and the meaningless, even though McX construes meaningfulness as the having, in some sense of having, of some abstract entity which he calls a meaning, whereas I do not. I remain free to maintain that the fact that a given linguistic utterance is meaningful or significant, as I prefer to say, so as not to invite hypostasis of meanings as entities, is an ultimate and irreducible matter of fact, or I may undertake to analyze it in terms directly of what people do in the presence of the linguistic utterance in question and other utterance similar to it. You see how the logical positivists are paying attention to what people do when they're playing the correct rules of the language in question. So they want to let the physicists, when they talk to each other, they can make each other set up experiments and measure things this way. Here's what their words actually mean. Nothing more than what they can understand together that points to consequences. They're going to look at how the words are being used and what they're doing to translate them into different words, which say this is all that's really being said here.
The relationships in between signifiers and signifieds are one-to-one, always one-to-one, and these relationships are neatly shared among the people in the physics of astrophysics community, for instance. They say a thing and the same concept pops in the mind of all other astrophysics, and so they really have a peer-to-peer conversation that actually is
Worse than that.
communication.
Yeah, that's true, but
To
it's
make
worse than that.
to make a concept common.
All that's true. They got their concepts, they got their terms. But then the logical positivists do something even worse. They come in and they listen at the door to what these physicists are saying, and they pay attention through a peephole, and they say, when this guy says this word, I don't know what concept they're referring to that they both agree on, but it forces this guy to recognize this fact. So even the concepts the physicists are using, the logical positivists can say, that's not really the idea. I understand the real ideas at play here. The real ideas are what they're forcing each other to recognize and nothing besides. Okay, so so they're coming in and they're listening in on other people's conversations and saying, look at when this guy says this, he makes this guy recognize the temperature change when you mix a bacid and an acid in a thing, and an acid in a thing, and it's an exothermic reaction. I don't care their concepts. I know what their concepts mean. I don't know what they think they mean. Maybe I do, maybe I don't, but I know what they really mean. What they really mean is, look at this thing. You can measure it. Here's what you have to be forced to recognize. That's all the words mean. Let's translate their language into the words we recognize as actually referring to the only things they could be talking about.
Yeah, but one thing that I must highlight here when speaking about science, usually when speaking about scientific theories, the models of science, and the scientists are talking to each other, they are usually talking about different aspects of the models themselves, which are not the physical reality. They are a simulation
Absolutely.
of the physical reality. They are very rarely speaking about the actual physical reality. They're talking about their, you know, elegantly as possible, simplified as you know as possible, but maybe not too simplistic, so that their predictions still work and whatnot. But they're usually talking about aspects of their models.
They're using their their familiar terms, and you're noticing those terms are figurative or metaphorical or something different than like the stuff Quine wants to affirm exists. And Quine
Well,
says, no problem.
figurative would be considered figurative strictly meaning objects with corporeality, objects made of atoms or photons or.
Is the atom a story or is it a thing?
Well, it might be a story, the story of its formation from subatomic particles and the story of it eventually breaking apart through nuclear reaction.
The atom is a thing which does a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it has its life. So I would say definitely atoms
But
have
the only
story.
things the only things that the scientists can measure are the things the atom is doing.
Yeah, the
So that's what they're
chemists
really
and
talking about. They're not talking about
yeah,
the atom.
the chemists and physicists, they don't even refer to the atoms by name because they are all supposedly the same, identical. Like all gold atoms are literally identical, and they cannot tell them apart. And also, they usually mention atoms with an abstraction, which is the moles, the Avogadro's number. They,
That's just like saying
you know,
dozen.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a number.
it's
Right?
a way to simplify. They use the scientific
They
notation,
do.
base,
Ten to the
potentials of
23rd.
10, powers of 10. Yeah, otherwise, they wouldn't leave the drawing board of numbers. They figured out we need to cut somewhere. We need to cut here because we need to kind of round up this to have a, in a ballpark number that's useful. But if we kind of try to calculate the number to the nth decimal, we would be calculating, the decimals of pi for eternity, and no work would be done. Even though pi has been calculated to such decimals that you could draw a circle of the size of the observable universe, and supposedly the error would be like a subatomic particle thick.
It's true. So the logical positivists are listening to these scientists using all these terms like atom and subatomic particle and all this stuff, and they're saying, how are they using the words? What are the words doing in their conversation? Let's translate their language into something that only means that. I'm not sure this would be correct for the logical positivists. We really need Tartaglia here because he's the one who's going to give us the real deep dive on these guys. But what if they said something like, something is here which pushes or registers on my machine in this way, or something like that? Now they're referring to something another scientist can check and say, I see that the machine is registering in this way because of the something that's doing it. Um, Okay, so that's the game they're playing, and let's see where he goes here with this ontology, because we're still trying to figure out what it is that he thinks we should affirm as existing. If we are allergic to meanings as such, we can speak. He doesn't want to say meanings, right? He wants to say significance, the significance of the term. If we are allergic to meanings as such, we can speak directly of utterances as significant or insignificant, and as synonymous or heteronymous, one with another. The problem of explaining these adjectives significant and synonymous with some degree of clarity and rigor, preferably, as I see it, in terms of behavior, it is as difficult as it is important. But the explanatory value of special and irreducible immediate intermediary entities called meanings is surely illusory. Up to now, I have argued that we can use singular terms significantly in sentences without presupposing that there are the entities which those terms purport to name. I have argued further that we can use general terms, for example, predicates like read or is read, without conceding them to be names of abstract entities. I have argued further that we can view utterances as significant and as synonymous or heteronymous with one another, without countenancing a realm of entities called meanings. So we can do this thing with language. We can do this thing with language, and we can do this third thing with language. At this point, since we can do all of that, McX begins to wonder whether there is any limit at all to our ontological immunity. Does nothing we say commit us to the assumption of universals or other entities which we may find unwelcome? I have already suggested a negative answer to this question in speaking of bound variables or variables of quantification in connection with Russell's theory of descriptions. We can very easily involve ourselves in ontological commitments by saying, for example, that there is something, now it's descriptive again, right? A bound variable, there is something, which red houses and sunsets have in common, or there is something which is a prime number larger than a million. But this is essentially the only way we can involve ourselves in ontological commitments, by our use of bound variables. The use of alleged names is no criterion, for we can repudiate their namehood at the drop of a hat unless the assumption of a corresponding entity can be spotted in the things we affirm in terms of bound variables. Names are, in fact, altogether immaterial to the ontological issue. For I have shown, in connection with Pegasus and Pegasi, that names can be converted to descriptions. This is their translation game. And Russell has shown that descriptions can be eliminated. Whatever we say with the help of names can be said in a language which shuns names altogether. To be assumed as an entity is purely and simply to be reckoned as the value of a variable. In terms of the categories of traditional grammar, this amounts roughly to saying that to be is to be in the range of reference of a pronoun. Pronouns are the basic media of reference. Nouns might better have been named pronouns. The variables of quantification, something, nothing, or everything, range over our whole ontology, whatever it may be, and we are convinced of a particular ontological presupposition if and only if the alleged presupposition has to be reckoned among the entities over which our variables range in order to render one of our affirmations true. All right, he's given us his method, but he's given it in the most convoluted or the broadest way possible. But let's try to see it here. If we must affirm some proposition, then the entities which that proposition presupposes to exist must be affirmed by us also. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the game of saying, because I named it, I must affirm that it exists. We're going to get rid of naming altogether. We're just going to translate Pegasus is the horse. No. Pegasus exists. No. Pegasus doesn't exist. No. We're going to translate that into the thing named Pegasus, or the Pegasus. I want to be careful. Not the Pegasus idea.
You have to up your game in naming things the Homeric way. with um, what's it called, epitaphs or whatever. You know, Homer just says, "Oh, that's not Athena. That's gray-eyed Pallas, daughter of Zeus,
Descriptive.
born of his skull."
Perfect.
Yeah, he basically
Genius.
he names the swift-footed one.
The
That's Achilles.
something we call
Yeah,
Athena, the something which
yeah,
is the gray-eyed daughter of Zeus, the
yeah.
something, yeah, okay, which just means I'm not naming or pointing at it. I'm just saying the something that we're referring
Epithets.
the something
Epithets.
called this, right? Okay, and then we can say, well, that doesn't exist, and there's no contradiction there. We may say, for example, that some dogs are white and not thereby commit ourselves to recognizing either doghood or whiteness as entities. Some dogs are white says that some things that are dogs are white. And in order that this statement be true, the things over which the bound variable something ranges must include some white dogs, but need not include doghood or whiteness, the abstractions. On the other hand, when we say that some zoological species are cross fertile, we are committing ourselves to recognizing as entities the several species themselves, abstract though they are. We remain so committed, at least until we devise some way of so paraphrasing the statement as to show that the seeming reference to species on the part of our bound variable was an unavoidable manner of speaking. So if we can we could get rid of abstractions, if we could even translate that statement into something else like some of the things which are grouped together in a zoological framework can breed with some of the ones grouped differently, something like that. Let's see what he does. But if you can't do that, if you have to use simply the phrase some species are cross fertile, then you have to then confirm the existence of the things that you're to which you're referring. Classical mathematics, as the example of primes larger than a million clearly illustrates, is up to its neck in commitments to an ontology of abstract entities. Thus, it is that the great medieval controversy over universals has flared up anew in the modern philosophy of mathematics. The issue is clearer now than of old, because we now have a more explicit standard whereby to decide what ontology a given theory or form of discourse is committed to. A theory is committed to those and only those entities to which the bound variables of the theory must be capable of referring in order that the affirmations made in the theory be true. Now he's saying it a little more concisely. If you're doing mathematics and you have to affirm a statement is true, like there is a prime number greater than a million, then your ontology is committed to those and only those entities to which the bound variables of the theory must be capable of referring. So, in other words, let's translate there is a prime number greater than a million to something exists which is a prime number, and that thing is also greater than a million, because we're using the bound variable, the something, right? We're saying there is a thing that is that. And we're saying it exists. Okay, go ahead.
But a prime number is, and any mathematical entity that has assigned to it through mathematics, according to the mathematicians, a property such as primeness. For the math to be mathing, the mathematicians need to prove that such number is prime, and the proof might be quite extensive and might occupy quite a bit of pages.
Yes,
so
it would.
Instead of just saying, 1 million and something is prime, they would say this number through which I do all these steps is, according to this proof, it's prime. This is the number.
Yes. Then that would be one way of doing it. They might be able to find another way of proving that it exists without even identifying what it is, but it would probably take pages of proof as well. Yeah. Because this standard of ontological presupposition did not emerge clearly in the philosophical tradition, the modern philosophical mathematicians have not, on the whole, recognized that they were debating the same old problem of universals in a newly clarified form. But the fundamental cleavages among modern points of view on foundations of mathematics do come down pretty explicitly to disagreements as to the range of entities to which the bound variables should be permitted to refer. Let's limit it. What do we have to say exists? This is where he's going to get to. Whatever you have to affirm exists in order to do your science. That's what we're going to say exists. Everything else we can hopefully translate into somethings or descriptives or whatever. I don't know. The three main medieval points of view, maybe that doesn't even get rid of them, but we're going to see what those descriptives have, what those bound variables have to affirm exist. That's what we're going to stick with. The three main medieval points of view regarding universals are designated by historians as realism, conceptualism, and nominalism. Essentially, these same three doctrines reappear in 20th century surveys of the philosophy of mathematics under the new names logicism, intuitionism, and formalism. This stuff is really interesting. Tartaglia knows it really well. I've been looking at his material he's putting together, and it's all really cool. Realism, as the word is used in connection with the medieval controversy over universals, is the Platonic doctrine that universals or abstract entities have being independently of the mind. The mind may discover them, but cannot create them. Logicism, represented by Frege, Russell, Whitehead, Church, and Carnap, condones the use of bound variables to refer to abstract entities, known and unknown, specifiable and unspecifiable, indiscriminately. Okay. Conceptualism holds that there are universals, but that they are mind-made. Intuitionism, espoused in modern times in one form or another by Poincaré, Brouwer, Weil, and others, countenances the use of bound variables to refer to abstract entities only when those entities are capable of being cooked up individually from ingredients specified in advance. As Frankel, Fraenkel, has put it, logicism holds that classes are discovered, while intuitionism holds that they are invented. A fair statement, indeed, of the old opposition between realism and conceptualism. This opposition is no mere quibble. It makes an essential difference in the amount of classical mathematics to which one is willing to subscribe. Okay, again, he's concerned with what do we have to affirm here. One of these views has a whole lot of things that exist. The other one can put it down to sets or something really limited. Okay, we say that exists, but then all this other stuff can be described in terms of that. All right, where were we here? It's no mere quibble. Okay, forgot. Logicists or realists are able, on their assumptions, to get Cantor's ascending orders of infinity. Intuitionists are compelled to stop with the lowest order of infinity, and as an indirect consequence, to abandon even some of the classical laws of real numbers. The modern controversy between logicism and intuitionism arose, in fact, from disagreements over infinity. Without going into depth in all these terms that he's throwing out here, I'm just going to say that the class on Gödel that Tartaglia is putting together, that goes along with his backbone class on Quine, which is also coming out soon, that Gödel class, is going to go into a lot of this stuff. And so if you want to know about the logic of mathematics and the attempts to do all sorts of things with it in the more recent times, stuff you've heard about with different types of infinity and figuring out the incompleteness theorems and all of that other stuff, he's going to talk a lot more about that, and I'm going to listen in and learn more about it. I've been watching his stuff, and it's going to be cool. Formalism, associated with the name of Hilbert, echoes intuitionism in deploring the logicists' unbridled recourse to universals. But formalism also finds intuitionism unsatisfactory. This could happen for either of two opposite reasons. The formalist might, like the logicist, object to the crippling of classical mathematics, or he might, like the nominalists of old, object to admitting abstract entities at all, even in the restrained sense of mind-made entities. The upshot is the same. The formalist keeps classical mathematics as a play of insignificant notations. This is a formalization. Of course, it's the formalists, right? They're going to formalize everything, which means ultimately getting rid of the meaning of what we're talking about, reducing it to a group of symbols and discovering what the rules are for playing with those symbols. That's formalization. This play of notations can still be of utility. whatever utility it has already shown itself to have as a crutch for physicists and technologists. But utility need not imply significance in any literal linguistic sense, nor need the marked success of mathematicians in spinning out theorems and in finding objective basis for agreement with one another's results imply significance. For an adequate basis for agreement among mathematicians can be found simply in the rules which govern the manipulation of the notions. These syntactical rules being, unlike the notations themselves, quite significant and intelligible. I have argued that the sort of ontology we adopt can be consequential, notably in connection with mathematics, although it is only an example. Now, how are we to adjudicate among rival ontologies? All right, what's our rule going to be for saying, okay, this guy put too many things in his list of stuff that is, this guy's got a better list or something like that? These two people are arguing. This guy has this on the list, this guy doesn't. Who's right? Certainly, the answer is not provided by the semantical formula to be is to be the value of a variable. This formula serves rather conversely in testing the conformity of a given remark or doctrine to a prior ontological standard. We look to bound variables in connection with ontology, not in order to know what there is, but in order to know what a given remark or doctrine, ours or someone else's, says there is. But in order to know what a given remark or doctrine, ours or someone else's, says there is, and this much is quite properly a problem involving language. But what there is another question altogether. In debating over what there are still reasons for operating on a semantical plane. One reason is to escape from the predicament noted at the beginning of this essay, the predicament of my not being able to admit that there are things which McX countenances and I do not. So long as I adhere to my ontology as opposed to McX's, I cannot allow my bound variables, right? Something, nothing, everything. My bound variables to refer to entities which belong to McX's ontology and not to mine. I can, however, consistently describe our disagreement by characterizing the statements which McX affirms, provided merely that my ontology countenances linguistic forms or at least concrete inscriptions and utterances. I can talk about McX's sentences. Another reason for withdrawing to a semantical plane is to find common ground on which to argue. Disagreement in ontology involves basic disagreement in conceptual schemes. Yet McX and I, despite these basic disagreements, find that our conceptual schemes converge sufficiently in their intermediate and upper ramifications to enable us to communicate successfully on such topics as politics, weather, and in particular, language. So since we can still talk about language, why don't we talk about what we're saying and what it actually implies, since it's difficult to talk about the differences in what we think exist without us referring to things that sometimes one or both of us or one or the other of us doesn't think exist. Insofar as our basic controversy over ontology can be translated upward into a semantical controversy about words and what to do with them, the collapse of the controversy into question begging may be delayed. It is no wonder then that ontological controversy should tend into controversy over language. But we must not jump to the conclusion that what there is depends on words. Translatability of a question into semantical terms is no indication that the question is linguistic. To see Naples is to bear a name which, when prefixed to the words see Naples, yields a true sentence. Still, there is nothing linguistic about seeing Naples. Our acceptance of an ontology is, I think, similar in principle to our acceptance of a scientific theory. All right, this is where he's been going with this the whole time. Say a system of physics. All right, now let's watch Roger what he does with the physicists. We adopt, at least insofar as we are reasonable, the simplest conceptual scheme into which the disordered fragments of raw experience can be fitted and arranged. Our ontology is determined once we have fixed upon the overall conceptual scheme, which is to accommodate science in the broadest sense, and the considerations which determine a reasonable construction of any part of that conceptual scheme. For example, the biological or the physical part are not different in kind from the considerations which determine a reasonable construction of the whole. To whatever extent the adoption of any system of scientific theory may be said to be a matter of language, the same, but no more, may be said to be the adoption of an ontology. But simplicity as a guiding principle in constructing conceptual schemes is not a clear and unambiguous idea, and it is quite capable of presenting a double or multiple standard. Imagine, for example, that we have devised the most economical set of concepts, the most economical set of concepts adequate to the play-by-play reporting of immediate experience. Whoa, awesome. We've just narrowed it down to whatever are the most economical set of terms we have to use to describe all the stuff that's happening. The entities under this scheme, the values of bound variables, are, let us suppose, individual subjective events of sensation or reflection. We should still find no doubt that a physicalistic conceptual scheme purporting to talk about external objects offers great advantages in simplifying our overall reports. Okay, so all right, let's narrow it down to the simplest scheme of language we can use to describe in a folk way between us what the heck is going on. That might not actually be the simplest language, he's saying, because our language, which externalizes and objectifies things in a physicalistic way, that might be better for some reason. Offers certain advantages. By bringing together scattered sense events and treating them as perceptions of one object, we reduce the complexity of our system of experience to a manageable conceptual simplicity. Okay, there's how you get more simple there. The rule of simplicity is indeed our guiding maxim in assigning sense data to objects. We associate an earlier and a later round sensum with the same so-called penny, or with two different so-called pennies, in obedience to the demands of maximum simplicity in our total world picture. Here we have two competing conceptual schemes, a phenomenalistic one and a physicalistic one. Which should prevail? Each has its own advantages. Each has its special simplicity in its own way. Each, I suggest, deserves to be developed. Each may be said indeed to be the more fundamental, though in different senses, the one is epistemologically, the other physically fundamental. The physical conceptual scheme simplifies our account of experience because of the way myriad scattered sense events come to be associated with singular so-called objects. Still, there is no likelihood that each sentence about physical objects can actually be translated, however deviously and complexly, into the phenomenalistic language. Physical objects are postulated entities which round out and simplify our account of the flux of experience. Look, let's just make this practical and we'll continue reading. Okay? He's got a lot of fancy terms here and he's not taking us by the hand. Let's say you were at a ball game. Crack. Ball goes flying. Lots of stuff going on here. There's the sound of the wind, the sound of the bat, the watching the ball, the reflection of the light on it. There's all sorts of things that everybody's experiencing. You're not paying attention. Everybody starts cheering and jumping up and down. Those are making noises. There's all sorts of phenomena that are happening to you that are inside your mind, like the ripples in your brain of the light has entered, the noise has entered, somebody's nudging me, right? The way it feels, I could describe it all. I was like, the sound woke me up and I turned my head swiftly and look at the ball shooting like a rocket over the wall. Hooray, the team is winning. I was filled with a rush of excitement, right? There's all sorts of ways I can describe that. That's epiphenomenal. It's epistemological, perhaps. It's not physicalistic. If I want to describe it physicalistically, I might say something like the parabolic path that the object of material called the baseball, which has a length, breadth, and width, and a certain reflective and an impenetrability, and the inelastic collision betwixt the bat and the ball, sent it at an initial velocity in this direction, with the rest of its path determined by the effects of the acceleration of gravity downward. Okay, fine. That's a different language. We have these two languages. And he's saying, what's interesting about the physicalistic language is I can reduce it to the ball, and then that sort of allows me to take all of the different experiences of everybody watching and all of the different experiences each individual is having and sort of tie a bow around it about this thing. this thing went flying, right? And so the objective language is able to describe something that we can then sort of put off the psychological imprints of it to another time. Maybe that makes it simpler if we're trying to describe what's happening in the world. All right, the physical conceptual scheme simplifies our account of experience because of the way myriad scatter sense events come to be associated with singular so-called objects. Still, there is no likelihood that each sentence about physical objects can actually be translated, however deviously and complexly, into the phenomenalistic language. Physical objects are postulated entities which round out and simplify our account of the flux of experience, just as the introduction of irrational numbers simplifies laws of arithmetic. From the point of view of the conceptual scheme of the elementary arithmetic of rational numbers alone, the broader arithmetic of rational and irrational numbers would have the status of a convenient myth, simpler than the literal truth, namely the arithmetic of rationals, and yet containing that literal truth as a scattered part. Similarly, from a phenomenalistic point of view, the conceptual scheme of physical objects is a convenient myth, similar simpler than the literal truth, and yet containing the literal truth as a scattered part. Now, what if class? This is so interesting. It's a good thing Tartaglia is going to give us a third-year alternative to the Nietzsche stuff with Quine. This is interesting. Now, what of classes or attributes of physical objects in turn? A Platonistic ontology of this sort is, from the point of view of a strictly physicalistic conceptual scheme, as much a myth as the physicalistic conception scheme itself is for phenomenalism, right? He's saying this is fantastic. We've got these two inclinations, these two ways of thinking. As Spinoza said, I can describe all of the events of the world subjectively, meaning not randomly or arbitrary, but as they appear and feel to me. Or I could describe them all objectively, length, breadth, width, object, hitting, motion, physical terms. He's saying if you take either perspective, the truths of the other side seem to you to be a myth. They sort of partially contain what you're talking about, scattered amongst it, but it's like that's a different kind of story. He's completely right about this. This Quine guy is so interesting. This higher myth.
Hold on, just before you go on. So could we say that doing science could be comparable to someone playing World of Warcraft? They have no idea at first how the game works and the game rules play out and what game rules are actually there. And as they progress, as they play, as they become immersed in this world, they experience what it does, what doing thing A does, what doing thing B does, and they start to hypothesize. They start to figure out, okay, what if I do thing C? Maybe it will have a different result. Maybe it will be advantageous to me as a player. And they start maybe even making spreadsheets with models of what those rules that were coded into the game supposedly are, to the point at which for the most part they can predict everything. But for people who create simulators like myself, I'm pretty sure that no one will ever, like, imagine if the Chinese were trying to reverse engineer the simulators that I've created. They would probably get the overall stuff, but the exceptional rules, the exceptions, they probably will have a hard time to get those. And so science is kind of like this. They are looking at the world, the essence of the world from several removes, and the essence of the world is whatever is holding these rules.
They're attempting to, yes.
Yeah, they're trying really hard, like someone is juggling, like I'm just juggling this and trying to figure out how much matter is there, if it's solid or if it's fluid. Is it water? Is it drinkable water? What pH is it? And just by doing this,
they're trying to extract themselves to God's perspective of the universe on the workbench in front of them. I would say that, first of all, I'm going to say that you're going to like the Popper classes that Tartaglia teaches as complementary course to Quine. It's the third year thing. You're going to really like the philosophy of science is really fun. But when you tell me you're trying to figure out how much wetness is there, how much temperature is there, how much solidity is there, what the length, breadth, and width is, I think to myself, you mean to you, right? Like that's a phenomenal experience. Your experience of measuring the thing is an impression made upon the subject, and you're not really outside the universe just making the facts of the measurements. You're dancing in the universe, which of course the latest physical experiments are showing. The act of observing disturbs the observed. So the physicists are inevitably getting to the point that Socrates knew they would get to, which is why he gave up on it and said, I can't, that's not the ultimate path, which doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. But the philosophy of science is super interesting, and you're going to get a lot of it from an Aristotelian pro science perspective in Tartaglia's alternative third year course, which I'll just put up again real quickly here. So what we're doing right now is some of this first year material where we just cherry pick little essays from people in different fields of philosophy, and we're doing metaphysics right now. And we've got the backbone where we do the same thing. But then we get to the third year where it's all about Nietzsche and this existentialism and stuff. But an alternative to that third year material is Tartaglia, who's going to come in here and do just a whole class on Quine. He really knows Quine well. He's been studying him forever. He's really fantastic on it. And as a result, you get to read Putnam and you get to read Popper, and you get to go into Gödel and all this number theory stuff and all this stuff that they were doing with mathematics. And Peirce, who's fantastic, by the way. So yeah, so that's coming at some point
Just
pretty
another
soon.
thing. Thanks for sharing that. That's really very interesting.
You're gonna like
I
it.
really loved Popper when I had a very tangential exposure to Popper in my high school. Basically, basically they only talked about how he emphasizes the importance of falsifiability of scientific conclusions or hypotheses. Also, in opposition to this simile that I described about someone trying to model a video game, someone trying to create a theory or a set of theories that describe how the video game or the simulation works, to predict, to optimize, even for a player to become an even better player, to the ethics of gaming in the World of Warcraft or whatever the game is. But in contrast to this, imagine you have a friend in the developer team and he just shows
Puts a
you the
little
source
alternative
code.
rule in there.
Yeah, he just shows you the source code. This is the simile, in my opinion, that is equivalent to revelation.
Okay, but is that, it's also, I'm guessing, what the scientists are aiming at.
Yeah, the scientists would
So their
love
discovery of
to
it is
sit down with
revelation.
God. They would love
Okay.
to sit down with God and pick his brain or whatever he has equivalent to a brain, to know, everything about the universe, especially the universe of materiality that they love so
But
much.
they're looking for the source code. They're looking for the rules which
Yeah,
determine why the things can't do certain things and always do other things predictably and stuff like that, right?
yeah,
Yeah, okay. I like your analogy with World of Warcraft. I remember Richard Feynman, who we talked about last year, endless praise for that mother flipper. He talked about it as, imagine you and I don't know how to play chess, but we start watching people playing chess.
yeah,
We start
yeah,
writing down in
yeah.
a notebook, what are the rules of chess? And we notice, oh, look at this. The kingside pawn, the kingside bishop is always on a white square. In every game we watch, the kingside bishop is always on a white square. Every time it moves, when it doesn't move, no matter where it moves, it's always on a white square. So I'm going to write, one of the rules of physics of the universe of chess is that a bishop stays on the square of its initial color or something like that. And then we watch 10,000 games and we see that that's always the case. And then we watch one game where the bishop is killed, captured, and a
Capture.
pawn is under promoted to a black square and becomes that same bishop again. The bishop is taken off the board, it comes back on the board, and it's on another square. Now we have to make more complicated rules.
Yeah,
So what's
yeah.
going on here? A bishop remains on its initial square unless it is removed and brought back on, and then it stays on whatever that color square is for the rest of the game, unless it is removed and brought back on again, or something like that. We start making more complicated rules to figure out what's going on with this chess thing. Yes, that's all interesting. Okay, so let's wrap up Quine here. We're almost done. Now, this is going to be the most dense essay we're going to read, I think, in this whole section, and a lot of people responding to him are going to say, look, they're going to have different views, which some of you are going to like a lot. Now, what of classes or attributes of physical objects in turn? A Platonistic ontology of this sort, from the point of view of a strictly physicalistic conceptual scheme, as much a myth as that physicalistic conceptual scheme itself is for phenomenalism. This higher myth is a good and useful one in turn, insofar as it simplifies our account of physics. Since mathematics is an integral part of this higher myth, the utility of this myth for physical science is evident enough. In speaking of it, nevertheless, as a myth, I echo that philosophy of mathematics to which I alluded earlier under the name of formalism. But an attitude of formalism may with equal justice be adopted toward the physical conceptual scheme in turn by the pure aesthete or phenomenalist. So he's recognizing this incompatibility of the two different Fictilian psychological camps, the two different Spinozian languages and which you're inclined to use. The analogy between the myth of mathematics and the myth of physics is, in some additional and perhaps fortuitous ways, strikingly close. Consider, for example, the crisis which was precipitated in the foundations of mathematics at the turn of the century by the discovery of Russell's paradox and other antinomies of set theory. These contradictions had to be obviated by unintuitive ad hoc devices. Our mathematical myth-making became deliberate and evident to all. But what of physics? An antinomy arose between the ungular and the corpuscular accounts of light. And if this was not as out and out a contradiction as Russell's paradox, I suspect that the reason is that physics is not as out and out as mathematics. Again, the second great modern crisis is the foundation of mathematics, precipitated in 1931 by Gödel's proof that there are bound to be undecidable statements in arithmetic, has its companion piece in physics by Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. In earlier pages, I undertook to show that some common arguments in favor of certain ontologies are fallacious. Further, I advanced an explicit standard whereby to decide what the ontological commitments of a theory are. But the question, what ontology actually to adopt, still stands open. And the obvious counsel is tolerance and an experimental spirit. Let us by all means see how much of the physicalistic conceptual scheme can be reduced to a phenomenalistic one. Still, physics also naturally demands pursuing irreducible in toto, though it be. Let us see how, or to what degree, natural science may be rendered independent of Platonistic mathematics. But let us also pursue mathematics and delve into its Platonistic foundations. From among the various conceptual schemes best suited to these various pursuits, one, the phenomenalistic, claims epistemological priority. Viewed from within the phenomenalistic conceptual scheme, the ontologies of physical objects and mathematical objects are myths. The quality of myth, however, is relative in this case to the epistemological point of view. This point of view is one among various, corresponding to one among our various interests and purposes. The well-roundedness, open-mindedness, all-inclusiveness, and metaphilosophical perspective that he has gives us a reason for why we should be diving into Quine a lot more. Tartaglia is coming to do that with an alternative third-year course. It's going to be impressive. So we'll have a lot more to say about Quine, and we're going to get Tartaglia in here to discuss it with us. You want to give him a call right now and see if he's around? Add him to the video here? Probably too late. Well, we can bring him in next time. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do now, this is the first essay we've read in Metaphysics. It's on What There Is by Quine. And again, let's look at this and say, okay, Uh, no properties, no fictional characters, no meanings allowed. We can escape them by translating our talk of such things into talk of only respectable entities. The paraphrases that we've translated, these paraphrases are the true intentions behind our sloppier speech from the physicalist perspective, perhaps. He proposes that we only include in our ontologies the entities required by our best scientific theories. This is a methodology for adjudicating the ontological disputes. But he says something a little bit broader here at the end, I think, which he's saying, let's explore all the possibilities and see what we can reduce it to. It's always got to be simpler. It's always got to be more reductive. We're open to consideration of Platonic entities. We're open to consideration of certain things, but you'd have to make the case. And let's see what terms must we use in our best scientific theories to describe things. Those are the things that we'll add to our list of things which exist, which is not just being a materialist, by the way, right? In a sense, because he's not saying, well, we have to affirm that atoms exist. He's saying we have to affirm whatever our most reduced and basic and best scientific theory tells us exists, which might include fields, right? If you can't talk about physics without mentioning the existence of fields, then he would say fields exist. And if you can talk about physics without referencing atoms, but talking about wave potentialities, then wave potentialities exist and atoms don't. Okay, so he's not being a materialist exactly when he's being a physicalist. But what he's saying is, for me, I want to affirm the existence of the things that I cannot escape affirming, that are implied and pointed to. Maybe I'm wrong because he doesn't like meaning. The things which have significance of the statements I must affirm in my best scientific theory. That's what Quine is up to, and I don't understand him well enough to talk too much more about it. But Tartaglia certainly does, and I've been looking at his material, and he's been teaching me this and talking with me about it for a long time. His classes are going to be really awesome if you want to know more about Quine, and they're coming.
Show the slide again, please. So the paraphrases are the true intentions behind our sloppier speeches.
Yep.
So does he mean with paraphrases different ways to say the same thing?
He wants to translate
so that we can hone in on the thing that we are trying to point at with our language? Okay.
He wants to say, when we say sloppily that the author of East West has red hair, what we really mean is something which wrote the book East West, and the only thing which wrote the book East West is also a thing which has red hair. Right? But he's trying to make it descriptive. So he's taking names which point to things and he's translating that language into stuff that's just descriptive so that you don't have to affirm something exists by using the statement, he thinks. He thinks he's doing that.
We are thankfully we are very, very sloppy indeed during our day-to-day lives, and we leave a lot to the implicit, and we have a lot that is explained by itself through context. Otherwise, we literally wouldn't end the conversation. We would just be explaining explanations and explanations of explanations, etc.
This is the game these logical positives want to play. They want to listen in to what the chemists are talking about, and then they want to figure out when a chemist says this about valence shell electron completion and repulsion, what does that force the other scientists to recognize that is measurable? Okay, whatever sentence he used, can I translate that into a sentence that only refers to that? So we're going to translate this. The physicists don't really know what they're saying, but I know what they're saying because I've been listening in, and I can tell that whatever they're saying that has significance is something that it can be recognized by their peers, and everything else that they have an idea or a dream or a notion or a figurative thing about, maybe they share it, maybe they have a different one. None of that matters. So I'm going to translate their language into something that's descriptive and that's pointing significantly at something that they can recognize. And I'm going to say that's what they really mean. They don't know what they mean, but I know what they mean philosophically, and that's all it means. That's sort of the game that they play.
It's
It's a semantic game, but semantics matter.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy game. But anyone who picks up a science textbook, say biochemistry, when you talk about when you go to the section where it talks about proteins, it gives you a very nice definition of proteins, supposedly nice.
Mm-hmm.
The definition will likely mention the uh, constituents, what are the building blocks of proteins and how they come together to form a protein. And so yeah, the logical positivists will go, oh, but you need to explain now the amino acids, what the heck are amino acids. And yeah, okay,
Well,
the amino,
no, they would take that talk about quaternary and tertiary folding of the proteins,
yeah,
and they would say, okay, when this guy says that, what does this guy expect to see when he uses his measuring tools?
yeah,
Okay, that's what he means. Okay, when he says this about proteins, what he means is you can calculate the quaternary folding of the set of amino acids and it will react this way instead of that way, and you can measure that. And so once I determined what the other scientist has learned from his statement about proteins, I could translate the word protein. I could translate the way they're using the words into something descriptive that signifies with significance, pointing at something, and then say the sentence means nothing beyond that. It's sort of almost like behavioralism. It's not the same trend, but it's the same inclination. And we even talk about behaviors. He mentions behaviors there. Like, what does it force the other people to behave differently? What do they do as a result of hearing those words? So
so
it's an Einsteinian
do the logical positivists kind of study the
inspired.
scientists, uh, like a David Attenborough commentary or something like that?
I don't know David Attenborough well enough. I think they're doing it like linguists.
No, David
They're
Attenborough is the wildlife narration guy.
oh yeah,
And
yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, this is a philosophical trend kind of inspired by Einsteinian revolutions in science, where these guys want to philosophically look back at this other stuff and do this translation game. Um, so what we're going to do next week now is we're off of Quine, but a lot of these essays are going to kind of be responding to him in one way or another. Carnap is going to say it's not that complicated, man. I agree with you. We don't want to include abstract objects in our ontology. It gets way too busy, way too crowded, way too messy. But there's a very simple way to avoid that. Notice the framework of your conversation. When I'm in mathematics, it makes sense to refer to numbers. How do I refer to them in the conversation? I say 2 and 1 make 3. I say there is a prime larger than a million because I'm in the framework of a mathematical discussion. It's a meta discussion to ask, is that thing real? Is a number real in ontology? I wasn't in that meta conversation. I was in this framework. In this framework, we can be fine talking about things without thinking that we're even making ontological claims, in a sense. So notice what framework you're in and don't worry about it referring to something that you could point to. That's a different conversation. It's not even making that claim. All right. So again, sort of the same inclination to avoid abstraction, to depopulate the overpopulated ontologies of some, but he does it in a different way that he thinks is simpler. And then we're going to say, well, do wholes exist? And we're going to have a debate, and it's kind of going to personify in a dialogue, in a drama between these two characters, Argyle and Burgle, and they're going to discuss, are holes real? Do holes exist? Right? Because a hole is an area with not like it's a negation. Maybe it's the lining of the hole that exists, and that's what we mean, right? They're going to just go back and forth and back and forth. This could be a really fun dialogue. And then we're going to do Chisholm. He's got a defense for the Meinongian view. A complete ontology must include objects that do not exist, right? So we're bringing back Pegasus again. If a sentence is meaningful, the terms must be referring to something. Now, he's not doing that pre-Quine, he's doing that post-Quine, right? So he's saying, I've heard what you have to say, but I don't think that works. We have to notice that the words refer to something. Even if they don't exist, they're in our ontology as fictional objects or non-actualizable potentials or whatever. Yablo's going to come in and give a direct challenge to Quine. Even a great deal of our scientific language, he says, you want to rescue us by saying, let's just look at what our best scientific theory is? I'm looking at that theory, and it's got an awful lot of metaphor in it. It's got an awful lot of figurativeness. Oh, the proton is pulling, it's pushing, it's attracting. What the fuck are you talking about? Right? Like, okay, I don't mean to use swear words, but like, have you noticed that there's a lot of metaphor in here, and that you didn't escape it? You didn't get to like a descriptive language here. You're still using story language, which is okay, but just notice that. Okay, metaphor and make-believe play are valuable, perhaps indispensable roles in communication and reasoning. Even our best theories might require the figurative. Unless we can distinguish between the literal and the figurative in our theories, which he thinks we can't and suggests we can't, what are we going to do with this idea? This isn't going to get us out of the problem, buddy. Amy is going to argue that fictional objects are real, that Hamlet is real, that Baker Street Dweller is real, Sherlock Holmes. Schaefer is going to give us foundationalism and try to say what's the grounding of saying something's real. So those are the essays we're going to read. A lot of them are going to be really fun. This one, I suspect, for some of the listeners was not as fun, but it's obviously significant. And we have to understand it to understand the realm of this conversation. So I'm glad we paid it some attention. We might need to bring Tartaglia in for a bonus video to talk about it more, because it deserves attention.
I feel kind of ontologically trolled by Quine.
Oh.
Yeah, because
he means what he's saying.
Yeah, well, we believe so, right?
Mm-hmm. No way to tell.
Yeah,
nature of trolls.
It can be an act.
It could be, but you might just again. He's wise enough to step back and say, to the epistemological, mythological, the phenomenological, what I'm saying sounds like a myth. And to the physicalists, what the phenomenologists are saying sounds like a myth. So he's able to step back. It's really profound. He's able to step back to this metaphilosophical perspective and say, I see what's going on here. And he's not even saying my physicalist inclination is superior necessarily. Let's keep exploring everything. And when the dust settles, we'll just see what we have to affirm. Maybe he's inclined to think it's going to be the physics stuff. Believe me, we can explain it all. Maybe, but we haven't gotten there yet. So he's even respectable enough to not give us the promissory notes that we often get from the materialists and the physicalists, who say, oh, eventually we'll have it all explained. What's going on in your brain? It's just events and processes and blah, blah, blah. I don't really understand it, but I'm sure that that's what it is. It's like, okay, that's a nice promissory note. Quine says, let's just keep investigating everything. Let's be open-minded and exploratory and scientific. Let's do our best to reduce things in all the fields that we can, see if we can translate between the two and whenever it's necessary. But when the dust settles, whatever our best scientific theories force us to affirm, those are the things I want on my list of ontology and nothing else. I want to keep it nice and short, nice and sweet, just those things. It's cool. It's a cool idea.
He wants to cut somewhere.
Yeah, he doesn't want Pegasus in his ontology. Stop it. Get out of here. It's great. All of the potential, like, how many potential people could be in my doorway? What are the fantastic things? Like, Hamlet could be in my doorway. Fat Hamlet could be in my doorway. Red-haired Hamlet could be in my doorway. 8 different Hamlets could be in my doorway. How many things do I have to say are real because I'm referring to them?
This is an
ugly world. What?
The dead cat of Schrodinger, even.
Right. Just because something is potential, or just because I can refer to it, doesn't mean that I have to say it's real in some way. The whole world is getting full of too many things. It's ugly. And you can see it's an inclination, a matter of taste. He even uses the word taste. I'm inclined to think that's ugly. That's partly why I don't like it. Right? But it is a matter of taste. And maybe he recognizes that that's true for both sides. So he's no dummy, right? This is not one of the lesser scientismists or something like that. Quine is impressive. Quine's really unbelievably impressive. So we're going to deal with it.
A matter of taste, like how young people just drink anything that has alcohol in it, even really bad wine and really crappy, piss poor beer. And then 2 decades pass and they only drink really good stuff. But
you got to develop taste
in smaller amounts.
Well, the differences between these two camps are somewhat a matter of psychological inclination, disposition, and taste as well. Speaking of drinks, let's go have an after show and we'll do another sip before we go. So, everybody, simultaneous sip. It makes everything better. Go. All right. We'll see you here next week. We're doing 2 classes a day, Monday through Friday. Metaphysics will pick up again at this 5 p.m. Eastern time next week.